what is going on. I'm going to dive right into this episode. We got a ton of material that I want to cover today. First and foremost, if you are a frequent flyer on the show, you watch a few episodes, maybe one or two, maybe all of them, you know that one of my favorite things to do on the podcast in this channel is to cover histories or episodes in histories or individuals who largely get overlooked. For whatever reason, we don't talk about them in history. Unfortunately, so much of history is lost on us because for one reason or another, we just don't discuss it in academia. It's not part of the curriculum. In this next series is certainly within that vein. When I say to you, when I think of the medieval period, when I say to you, what comes to mind when you think of the Dark Ages, the early medieval period, later medieval period? To me, it's Normans, it's Vikings. It is, or, it's the Franks, it's Charlemagne, King Henry, however many, there's like a bunch of King Henrys. Certainly Crusader Knights, the different orders, right? Templars, Hospitallers, the Crusades themselves. The one thing, it boggles the mind, the one thing that doesn't immediately come to mind, that should come to mind, is medieval Spain. What is going on in Spain? And embarrassingly, I didn't even know about this history for nearly my entire life until I went back to school. I was actually in a class called the History of Texas. It was a required class. In order to understand the history of Texas, you have to understand the medieval period within Spain. And so we discussed it in the class, and my brain nearly exploded as to how awesome it is. I mean, it is one of the most fascinating pieces of history we have within that time period, and it rarely, if ever, gets discussed. And if you're a huge fan of the West, maybe you live in the United States, maybe you're in Europe, whatever, but if you appreciate Western values, Western culture, Western tradition, you should frankly be on your hands and knees thanking the people of Spain and Portugal for what their ancestors did and what they were willing to go through in order to, quite frankly, defend not just themselves, but all of Europe and what is we would call today Western traditions. Before we get into the nitty gritty, I want to discuss the common narrative. If you are to read about this period, what is it you are more than likely going to read? The history of medieval Spain that's taught in mosques, in university classrooms, certainly in high school classrooms, all over YouTube. There's not a lot on YouTube, coincidentally, but the stuff that is out there is really not good, not great. But the story that you're going to get online is the rise and fall of Al-Andalus, which is the Islamic Spain, essentially. And it's a tragedy. It is a story of paradise lost. According to many, this 800-year period, we saw the rise of Islam to its pinnacle in the golden age of Islam, where, frankly, Muslims and Jews and Christians all coexisted and lived in peace amongst each other. It was a multicultural utopia, if you will, and it was certainly one of the most tolerant regions in the world. The next major pillar of this narrative, this thesis, is that the Islamic rulers, the peoples, the nobility within Al-Andalus brought about all kinds of advancements, essentially in mathematics, in music, architecture, philosophy, and just generally all throughout society, poetry. And they go one step further and claim that if it was not for the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, but in particular Al-Andalus, most of our Western tradition, most of our Western history would be lost because essentially during the Dark Ages, the story goes, many of the texts that define Western culture, so think Marcus Aurelius, Plato, Aristotle, all of these different things that came from ancient Greece, from ancient Rome, they were essentially lost. And then the Muslims rediscovered them, translated them, and then we were able to have copies of copies of copies that would go on to help define the Christian world. And then also, we'll get into more of this in a minute, but at the time of the Islamic invasion, the Visigoths had taken over the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is just what is now Spain and Portugal. And they had taken over, and there were roughly a few 100,000 of these Visigoth nobility, royalty, and then there were millions of native Spanish inhabitants that existed there. And the Visigoths were backwards, they were barbaric, they were uncultured, they were uncouth, immoral. And if it wasn't for Islam, they would not have been excised out of power. David Levering Lewis, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and professor of history at NYU, in his book, God's Crucible, Islam in the Making of the World, notes, quote, "In the Middle Ages, there emerged two Europes, one Muslim Europe, secure in its defenses, religiously tolerant, and maturing in culture and scientific sophistication, the other Christian Europe, an arena of unceasing warfare in which superstition passed for religion and the flame of knowledge sputtered weakly." So again, like Lewis and others, they just make the claim that during this period, from the fall of the Roman Empire, European powers, European tribes, kingdoms, they fell into a dark period that was malevolent. And while this was happening, across the Mediterranean, you had the rise of Islam, and it was this tolerant, brilliant, full of universities and intellectuals and culture, and they sort of faced off one another for hundreds, if not thousands of years, nearly thousands of years. There's an individual, he's not an imam, I think he's just a sheikh, but he is certainly a teacher, historian, and scholar. His name is Dr. Yasir Qadhi. And by the way, forgive me on my pronunciations. If you've watched other episodes, I cannot pronounce anything that is not English, so I apologize. Dr. Qadhi essentially claims all these things. He claims that Islamic armies were actually rescuing the native inhabitants, the native people of Spain. And there were actually individuals within the Visigoth regime who went to North Africa and invited the Muslims to come invade, and then moreover to take over once they had gotten rid of the Visigoth overlords. He says, quote, by the way, this is transcribed from him speaking, so if it sounds weird, it's not. He didn't write this. He was speaking it. Quote, "So 711 is when the famous general Tadiq bin Zayed, he was a young general, maybe 19 or 20 years old, gathers together the forces, especially the Berber Arabs of North Africa." Just a side note, that's a misnomer. There's no such thing as a Berber Arab. There are the Berbers, and then there are the Arabs. Okay, anyways. And they cross over the Straits of Morocco, and he begins conquering. Now, why did he begin conquering this region? I just want to pause for one quick second here. Whenever you hear apologists or scholars or people that try to promulgate the brilliance of Al-Andalus or frankly any of the conquests executed by the Islamic armies during this period, in Islam, they are only authorized to fight defensive wars. And it gets kind of awkward because for legitimately hundreds of years, they were invading and conquering their neighbors. And so whenever they have these discussions, this is a point that they really have to highlight and explain so that they can ensure that their audience understands that essentially their armies were fighting within the framework of what Islam dictates. Okay. A number of stories are told. Most likely, one of the local kings by the name of King Roderick was greatly despised. This is a story that is found in our books of history, and one of his prime ministers revolted against the king, and he tried to do a coup d'etat against the king, who everyone hated, the standard tyrannical king. He was caught, and he was going to be executed, and this prime minister, he escaped and fled for his life, and he fled down south to the land of the Umayyads. Dr. Yasir Qadhi basically explains that the prime minister bent the knee to the Umayyads, who were in North Africa, and just said, hey, look, guys, we need you to come help us. We have this fascistic, tyrannical king. He's a dictator. He's evil. He's awful. We need you to come and liberate us, and not only liberate us, but we would like you to be the new ruling class. The Dr. Yasir continues. He says, quote, "We," now he's speaking as if he is a native Hispanic Christian, "are more than happy to let you invade and you take over. We know you guys are going to have less taxes and more freedom." Dr. Yasir sort of does this sidebar, and he mentions that there is a bunch of religious tensions amongst the Christians within Spain at this time, and claims that various Christian sects could not practice freely in Spain. He's loosely referring to, and again, I'm going to get into the details later, but there was two sort of Christian groups that existed, or factions, whatever you want to call them, belief structures that existed within Spain at this time. The Visigoths were Arians, and the native inhabitants were Catholic, although his timing is way off. Which we'll get into in a minute. He then states, quote, "And the Christians knew the Muslims didn't care if you were a non-Muslim, you're going to be able to worship. And they're not going to care which version of a Christian are you." According to Yasir's History of Islam, Sharia, essentially, the claim that he's trying to make is that there were Christians that believed that Sharia was more tolerant than whatever they were living under, whatever law code they were living under, and that it would be far more beneficial to live under the auspices of Islamic rulership. I sort of talked about this, but I want to dive in a little deeper. Many, if not most scholars, historians argue that the Visigoths, the Franks, these other Germanic peoples had fallen into moral, civil, and cultural decay. Hence, we refer to this period, obviously, as the Dark Ages. Anthony Wilde, in his book Coffee, A Dark History, buttresses Dr. Yasir Qadhi's narrative and the situation this way. He says, quote, European culture had, since the sack of Rome in AD 455, gone into a dramatic decline known as the Dark Ages. Middle Eastern culture, by contrast, was flowering, with the added impetus provided the new religion of Islam. So as the narrative goes, as the story goes, the Islamic rulers in Al-Andalus, once they'd taken over, excised the Visigoths and replaced them with a much more sophisticated, tolerant governance, while simultaneously they were bringing about all kinds of advancements. Like I said, culture, music, philosophy, poetry, architecture, so on and so forth. And chiefly, just to double down, they argue that if it was not for Islam, Western culture, Western tradition, values, whatever, it would simply not exist, because all of our history within our texts, the concepts, the ideas, they would have all disappeared. In his book, Dogs of Gods, Columbus, the Inquisition, and the Defeat of the Moors, author James Reston Jr. writes, quote, in arts and agriculture, learning, and tolerance, Al-Andalus was a beacon of enlightenment to the rest of Europe. Among its finest achievements was its tolerance. Jews and Christians were welcomed, if not as equals, then as full-fledged citizens. They were permitted to practice their faith and the rituals without interference. This tolerance was in keeping with the principles of the Quran, which taught that Jews and Christians were to be respected as quote-unquote peoples of the book, or believers in the word of God. Jews and Christians were assimilated into Islamic culture, and occasionally Moorish leaders helped build Christian houses of worship. None of this is accurate. In fact, it is in many situations quite the opposite. The story of the rise and fall of Al-Andalus is not a story of paradise lost, but rather it is a redemption story. It is a revenge story. It is a story of people who were violently conquered, and a few of them, some of them, were able to escape. They were persecuted. Their culture was largely erased for religious reasons, and many of them were banished, and they moved northwards. It is a Star Wars story. There is a rebel alliance, a medieval rebel alliance that sought to thwart the occupiers and the invaders over the course of 800 years. I mean, one generation after the next, they would slowly but surely reconquer their ancestral lands, their native lands, along a hostile frontier. Had it not been for the Hispanic-Roman Catholic people within this region, there's a very good chance the entire Western world, as we know it today, either would not exist or would just look radically different. If you're a huge Game of Thrones fan, like, this is Game of Thrones on steroids, and you're gonna love every second of it. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Okay, so we are going to sort of reverse or back up a little bit. Thousands of years prior to all of these events, the Phoenicians, during the Archaic period, created colonies within the Spanish Peninsula, or the Iberian Peninsula. And then they sort of controlled the area. Eventually, there was the rise of Rome and Carthage. The Carthaginians took over this area, and they went to war with Rome during the First and Second Punic War. Famously, we talk a lot about Hannibal and Scipio Africanus. I'd love to go more into that, but for the sake of time, I gotta keep moving here. The Romans defeated the Carthaginians in the first century CE. They took over the Iberian Peninsula, and then finally, as the Roman Empire began to collapse in on itself, there was a power vacuum, and eventually, in the 5th and 6th century, the Visigoth tribe, if you will, took over that region. For those of you who are sort of curious, why was this such an attractive area to take over? There were silver mines. I believe there were gold mines. the agricultural lands were very versatile and fertile. And so therefore there was just a whole host of wealth and resources you could draw from this region, up to and including the peoples of there to use in your army, as we're going to get into a second. A lot of them played a critical role within the Roman Empire. Spain became a Roman province. Almost immediately, they became very Romanized. They took to being a part of the Roman Empire. They served in the Roman military. And like I said, they just, culturally speaking, they adopted a lot of Roman practices, as did many of the Germanic tribes. And in the 5th century, the Visigoths traveled over the Pyrenees and set up shop and began to essentially wage war against the Franks, as well as the Eastern Roman Empire was attempting to expand and re-solidify the sort of Roman power that they had lost within the Mediterranean. And so they had landed as well on the Iberian Peninsula, and again, were at war with the Visigoths. There was one other, I think there was like a 3rd or 4th tribe that was involved in there as well. I just can't remember the names. Joseph F. O'Callaghan, in his beast of a textbook titled A History of Medieval Spain, he summarizes the Romanization of the people of Spain. It says, quote, "By incorporating Spain into their empire, meaning the Romans, they gave it a cultural foundation that subsisted in large measure through the vicissitudes of later centuries." And really what he is touching on here is that despite the fact that the overlords or the leadership of the Iberian Peninsula would sort of shift over and over again, and there would be crushed by civil war or internecine fighting within the noble classes. And obviously you had the Romans and the Visigoths, and then you had the Muslims. Despite all of these trials and tribulations, if you will, the people of Spain clung to their Hispano-Roman identity. And especially when they became Catholics, they clung to Catholicism as well. Much like the people of Spain over the course of the Roman Empire and other tribes, this happened to many Germanic tribes. The Visigoths became highly Romanized. They adopted many of the cultural practices of Rome, religiosity, language, politics. O'Callaghan, again, he notes this quote: "The course of peninsular history during that time was comparable to that of the other barbarian kingdoms of Western Europe, but to a greater degree than elsewhere, the Visigoths bowed to the superior civilization of Rome and adopted as their own the Latin language, the Orthodox Christian religion, and much of the substance of Roman law." In his book, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, Dario Fernandez Morera supports or buttresses O'Callaghan's theory. And just to sort of come back again, they both quickly just completely debunk Dr. Yasir Qadhi's thesis, which, just to remind you, is this idea that the Visigoths were so tyrannical and so backwards and so barbaric that the Hispanic Roman people of Spain were desperate to have new rulership. And so they went to the Muslims and basically begged them to come excise the Visigoths out of their land. Morera notes, quote, "Never mind that modern archaeology has confirmed that the Dark Ages were less dark than is usually proclaimed and quite enlightened when compared with Muslim culture prior to the Arabs' conquest of the Middle East and North Africa, or that Spain was under Roman control and influence longer than any Western land outside of Italy and produced more Latin writers and emperors than any other Roman province, or that the Visigoths were the most Romanized of all the peoples that took over the Latin Roman Empire, and that they played an important role in the making of Western civilization, or that the Visigothic leaders spoke Latin and had spent generations in military and political service with the Romans, were decisive in the Latin Roman Empire's victory over the Huns of Attila at the Battle of Catalonian Plains in 451, or that recent discoveries of urban archaeology have underlined the importance of Visigothic architecture in Spain, its magnificent metallurgy, its great city of Reconquest, the innovative and transformation nature of Visigoth culture, and how it proved the basis for the construction of medieval Europe, or that Visigoth law was no more quote-unquote brutal than contemporary medieval Islamic or Jewish law, or that Visigoth women enjoyed a degree of autonomy in the public sphere not available to a free Muslim married woman, also referred to as a muasana, because of the great modesty of Muassana life in medieval Islam, or that Visigoth had several female monarchs who played important political roles in the Visigoth kingdom. So in 466, there was a Visigoth king named Uric who gained the throne, and he set up his capital in sort of what is now southern France, known as Toulouse, and obviously borders between the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal and France. None of that stuff existed yet. So it was all like just everything was sort of moving and changing and evolving at all times. But in 466, King Uric set up shop, and he was vying for power within Spain. He had allowed or facilitated many of the native indigenous people of the Iberian Peninsula to join administrative positions within his government, and he continued to utilize the Theodosian code of law and would grow on that. Unlike the Islamic invaders, the Visigoth people's armies, they did not radically attempt to alter or change the way of life within Spain. If anything, they were trying to be embraced by the local populace, and therefore, instead of forcing cultural differences or their Aryan religion onto the Catholic people of Spain, they instead adopted their way of life, which again is just radically different than the approach the Islamic armies took when they came in and took over. So one good example of this is nearly all conquering armies up to and including Caesar, Alexander the Great, the Islamic Umayyads when they invaded Spain and other places throughout North Africa and the Middle East. One of the things they 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time they're going to do is they're going to rename the area. So the Macedonians took over what is now what is now Turkey. They renamed it the Seleucid Empire. When the Muslims took over the Iberian Peninsula, they renamed it Al-Andalus, which is loosely in reference to the term Vandals, I believe, although that's disputed. However, when the Visigoths came in, they did not change the name of their new kingdom it wasn't really an empire, but they did not change the name of the region. In fact, continue, and you can see it in the writings, continued to use the native term Hispania in order to describe the Iberian Peninsula, indicating that they were deeply interested in being absorbed or accepted by the native population. Now, the major conflict when they first arrived and first took control between the Visigoths and the Hispanic people was religion. They were Arian. The Visigoths were Arian. The Hispano-Roman people were Catholic. You could write a whole dissertation on the differences between the two, but fundamentally, the Arian people did not believe in the Holy Trinity, and obviously Catholics did. This indeed caused a lot of friction and heartburn. Finally, in 568 CE, King Leovigilid, I can never pronounce his name, he established his new kingdom in the heart of Spain. This is sort of right around the time when they were able to defeat all of the various interested parties in taking over. They were defeated, they were leaving, they were gone. And so this new king set up the capital in the heart of Spain in Toledo. And much of the culture, he was simply trying to imitate what was going on in the Eastern Roman Empire in terms of just minted coinage as well as architecture. He also revised Uric's law code and terminated the 4th century imperial ban on intermarriage between Visigoths and the Hispanic-Roman peoples, which indeed is a critical step to assimilation. And it's, we're always talking about, or historians and intellectuals are always talking about how tolerant the people of Al-Andalus were, and yet they in no way, shape, or form were willing to assimilate like the Visigoths were doing in this era. In Al-Andalus, a Muslim man could indeed marry a Christian woman, but the reverse was not true. So a Muslim woman could not marry a Christian man, and then all of their offspring, if it was a Muslim man and a Christian woman, would of course be raised Muslim. So King Leovigilid, I can't pronounce his name. He attempted to convert the Visigoths to Catholicism, but he failed. However, his son Ricard in 586 was able to finish the job at the Third Council of Toledo, and indeed converted the Visigoth people, or the whole region, I should say, to Catholicism, which indeed removed all sort of friction between the two different groups. Although when we think of the medieval period, we obviously think of king or kingships or monarchies, and most of them automatically, at least for me, I assume that it's hereditary, right? That you have the king and the eldest son takes over the throne once the king passes, and or very often, if there are multiple sons, particularly I believe in the Carolingian Empire, he ended up splitting his kingdom into, I think, 3 different regions for each one of his sons. The Visigoths were slightly different. They were unable to structure or crystallize their power in a monarchical hierarchy sort of sense. So when the king would pass, they actually would have some sort of elective process. Presumably, I want to say there was sort of like an oligarchy, if you will, among the nobles, and the nobles would elect their next king. And the problem with that is that it would cause all kinds of civil unrest, chaos, and internecine fighting among the nobles. And indeed, this was one of the underpinnings that made them vulnerable, or their power vulnerable, within the peninsula, and essentially allowed the Islamic powers to wedge themselves in and take advantage of the situation. The impending Islamic invasion is extraordinarily confusing. We have different reports. The Islamic sources say one thing, and the Christian sources unfortunately don't substantiate what the Islamic sources are saying. So again, it's confusing. However, there's a general narrative that many historians fall on or believe in or lean into. There was a king named Rodrigo who took the Visigoth Hispano-Roman throne, and he was sort of, not, I don't want to say fighting against, but he was at odds with another noble family known as the Witsitzas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In effect, essentially, this family was unwilling to submit to King Rodrigo and his rule. And so, according to our Islamic sources, there was an individual named Count Julian who was either in the family or a member of that group. And he deployed to the North African area where the Umayyads, the Islamic powers, had set up shop, and basically went to them and said, hey, I want your assistance. We have this king and I want to oust him and get rid of him. But there's absolutely no evidence, so far as I can tell, that we know for sure or can say for certain or even close to that this individual, Count Julian, and his family that he was supporting or a part of, was asking for the Muslims to come in and completely take over the peninsula and completely get rid of Visigoth rule. In July of 710, 400 men, it was a reconnaissance force, by all accounts, headed by Tarif ibn Maluk, landed in Spain and raided the countryside. This was sort of the way in which the Muslims would preempt a strike. They would send in a reconnaissance force, figure out what it was they were going to deal with, if they wanted to deal with it at all. And as much as they could, they would try to take back as much loot as humanly possible. Morera notes, quote, according to the anonymous 10th and 11th century Muslim chronicler Akbar Muaha, Tarif came back with loot and with, quote, female captives so beautiful as Musa and his people had ever seen. In 711, Tariq ibn Zayed invaded Spain with 7,000 men. King Rodrigo prepared his forces and was getting ready to intercept him. But by the time he had established his army to meet the Islamic invading force, Tariq's numbers had swelled to 12,000. On July 19th, 711, there was the fateful battle along the Guadalete River, again, I cannot pronounce any of these words, between Visigoth forces and the Islamic 12,000 invading force. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, King Rodrigo had decided to allow one of the Witsitzas family members, remember the other noble Visigoth group, to command one of his flanks. And during the battle, his flank just left. They abandoned the cause, which completely exposed one of Rodrigo's flanks, and the Islamic army absolutely crushed them. And obviously, many historians, including O'Callaghan, have basically determined or concluded that this was pre-planned, that the Witsitzas family knew that they were going to do this. It was not as if, at least as far as we can tell, during the battle, they just decided to flee haphazardly on their own. O'Callaghan reports, quote, the defeat was complete. But if the family of Witsitzas hoped to regain the throne, they were seriously disillusioned. Tariq realized that the backbone of the Gothic resistance had been broken and that the kingdom could be taken. His expedition, originally intended only as reconnoiter, had achieved one of the greatest victories in the annals of Islam. Many contemporary sources at the time, as well as modern historians and scholars, debate how and why the Islamic armies were essentially able to just take over the entire country, or region rather, so quickly, roughly within 10 years. And quite frankly, there's a multiplicity of reasons. Like I said before, a lot of it had to do with the civil wars leading up to that preceded the situation in the previous 30 years, the civil wars and internecine fighting amongst various Visigoth noble royal families were just battling with one another, which completely destabilized the area and the situation in the region, making them more susceptible to enemy invasion or incursions. However, there's a sort of another layer, which is that the Islamic armies were so effective and had been campaigning for so long, literally approximately 100 years prior to even this invasion, that it seems completely unlikely that even if they had a unified front, they would have been able to stop him. The Islamic religious zeal, the momentum, like I said, just in their capacity to carve out this massive caliphate empire, they would have won essentially no matter what. They might have been slightly delayed had there not been so much civil unrest already in the Iberian Peninsula, but more than likely, it was just a matter of time before the Visigoth kingdom fell. Morera notes that the Islamic invaders were, quote, unified, skilled, fierce, and well-led. The men that had invaded were experienced, and they were just experienced warfighters. And the Berbers that made up most of the Islamic forces during the initial invasion were recent converts. And, quote, these former pagans were imbued with the religious fervor of the new convert and the hunger for loot of the marauding tribesmen. Something that I think is worth noting, many scholars, including professors that I had when I went to school, when they discuss this period, they describe or reference the Islamic conquests in the 7th and 8th century and 9th centuries as a migration or expansion. It was anything but. It was obviously a conquest. And like I said, it took still roughly 10 years for Islamic forces to completely take over the Iberian region. And most of the people, as we're going to discuss in a minute here, fled towards the north near the Pyrenees mountain range. So one of the things we must discuss is the concept or the idea of jihad, particularly in this period. And I don't really want to get into what it means today. There's a lot of back and forth. I think that the concept of jihad has shifted radically over the course of hundreds, if not thousands of years. But at the end of the day, it is a religious obligation that Muslim men must go to war in the name of Islam at least once a year. Although today many apologists, scholars, imams suggest that it is sort of a internal struggle. I think they refer to it as like the small jihad and the large jihad, and I can't remember which is which. But they try to argue that it's this sort of self-improvement. In this period, there's absolutely no evidence that jihad was meant to be interpreted as self-improvement. It was purely just holy war in accordance with the Hadith and the Quran. As noted by Soha Aboud Hagar, professor of Islamic and Semitic studies at the University of Madrid, the purpose of jihad is to, quote, make war in order to outspread the Islamic religion and implement its laws throughout the entire world, and its reward is paradise. Now, buttressing this concept of jihad, you have different schools of belief or thought within Islam, and in particular, Malikism was a specific cultural and political school within Islamic thought that dominated Spain. So basically, a lot of their jurisprudence came directly from Malikism. Replete within Malikai's teachings, martyrdom while fighting in the name or the way of Allah was absolutely paramount. It states, quote, the messenger of Allah said, I would like to fight in the way of Allah. I would be killed. Then I would be brought back to life. Then I would be killed. Then I would be brought back to life, and I would be killed. And there are a multiplicity of different sort of phrases that are in line with this, describing exactly what I'm talking about. Here's another one, quote, the messenger of Allah once came to her, Haram, and she fed him. She sat to delouse his hair. Then the messenger of Allah slept, and later he woke up smiling. She said, what makes you laugh, O messenger of Allah? He said, "People of my nation, raiding in the way of Allah, they were riding in the middle of the sea, kings on thrones." Morera concludes, quote, "All Malachi legal treaties followed this exclusively martial understanding of jihad. The 10th century Khatib al-Tafri, one of the Malachi manuals most widely read in Islamic Spain, discusses jihad only as holy war. I can't pronounce this guy's name. I'm sorry. Malio Salgado, a Spanish historian and philologist, noted that Malachi manuals from this period in Spain stipulate, quote, "Holy war must be waged each year. It is a duty of solidarity. Some must contribute with their own selves, others with their possessions, imposed on every free Muslim male." There's also the speed at which the Islamic armies could move across the peninsula was absolutely incredible. And so what they had to do was basically move from one stronghold or urban center or city or municipality to another, and they couldn't linger. They basically had to hit it, take it over, defeat whatever force or garrison was there, and then just drive on with their conquest. One of the ways they were able to do this is that indeed there was a minority Jewish population that existed within the Iberian Peninsula, and they unfortunately were treated very poorly by the Catholics, by the Visigoth noble royal families. And so they were more than happy to assist the Muslims during the invasion. So a Muslim army would come in, they would take over a center or location, and then right before they were leaving, they would basically assign leadership, if you will, to a group of Jewish indigenous peoples, as well as they would leave a small contingent of Muslim forces there with them. There were three options while the Islamic forces were conquering when they came into contact and took over these cities. And basically, obviously the Roman Hispano people had to submit to them. The three options included they could convert to Islam, they could become dhimmis, which is a second-class status citizen under Islamic rule, and they would have to pay the jizya, which is a special tax for non-Muslims, which is very different than another specific Muslim tax that they would press on other Muslims called the zakat, which was simply meant to purify them, and it was to be given to other poor Muslim groups. If they did not yield, then the Islamic armies could just do whatever they wanted. Christian men would be killed during jihad, while women and children were taken as slaves or captives. Malachi legal treaties or texts dictated that under jihad, if women were captured, Muslim warriors were free to have sexual intercourse with them and turn them into slaves. One of the pieces of evidence that historians use to suggest that the Visigoths were a unsophisticated peoples was the fact that we have little to no archaeological evidence of their existence particularly in the southern portion of Spain. But this is a huge misnomer. They were very sophisticated. They were using all kinds of influential architectural designs, cultural influences from obviously the Eastern Roman Empire in particular, but also from Rome generally, that had become just entrenched within this area for hundreds and hundreds of years. The reason why nothing exists from their period when they were in charge or ruled over the Iberian Peninsula is simply because the invading armies destroyed everything they could get their hands on. Churches were taken apart, and any sort of biblical scriptures were destroyed. Both Christian and Muslim sources describe the invasion and the conquest in apocryphal terms. It was sort of end of the world descriptions, if you will. Al-Qadarbas and Abd al-Wahad al-Marakushi describe how Musa ibn Nasir waged 3 years of war in jihad against the natives, sacking and enslaving the indigenous population. Other Islamic sources note that Musa spent time pillaging and organizing the conquered lands. Another tactic that they would use, again, to sort of allow them to facilitate the speed at which they conquered the Iberian Peninsula, was they would use this thing that many scholars refer to as the carrot and stick method. Once they would come to an urban center or city, they'd basically say, hey, if you submit, we won't destroy your city, we won't enslave you, we will not kill you, and we will in fact allow your noblemen to not only remain alive, but we may even consider to keep them on as sort of administrators, if you will. Obviously, many indigenous Spanish Christians, Catholics refused, and what followed was total and complete devastation. Morera describes it in this way. He says, quote, The history of Spain, commissioned by King Alfonso X in the 13th century, corroborates the carrot and stick methods described in the Muslim chronicles. These Christian accounts tell us that Musa offered peace and privileges to those Christian noblemen and church leaders who did not resist, but killed those who did. Musa burned any city that resisted and, quote, crucified the nobility and the older men and cut to pieces the young men and the infants. According to one Muslim chronicler, Al-Hakam, Musa wrote back to his caliph in Damascus to give him an update of the sort of the status of the conquest within Spain. And he describes their actions as, quote, not a conquest, but the judgment day. In the history of Spain by King Alfonso X, he describes how Muslim conquerors burned cities, killed and executed men, took women as sex slaves, sacked churches, tore away all of the sacred relics or paraphernalia as booty. They burned Bibles or any Christian written works that they could find, and either broke or burned crosses, seeing both literature and any sort of Christian iconography as heretical or unholy, basically. Ibn Rushd al-Jad, circa 1126, wrote on what to do with Christian paraphernalia. He said, quote, question, what should be done with the sacred books that one finds inside the churches of the Rum and the Islamic, the Muslims in Iberia or in Spain would refer to the local indigenous people as Rum, but they were basically referring to them. That was their way of saying Romans. In enemy lands, what should be done with their gold crosses and other objects one finds? Answer, the gold cross must be broken up before being distributed as booty to the Muslim warriors, but one must not distribute them directly. As for their sacred books, one must make them disappear. We now have archaeological records of a whole variety of caches, if you will, leading from the south to the north as people were fleeing away from the invaders to try to get away from them, essentially, and go into the mountains in this sort of safe haven of Asturias and Galicia. They cached various Christian relics and treasures. And archaeologists have actually been able to recover a whole host of these caches. One 9th century Islamic chronicler named Muhammad ibn al-Razi claimed that Umayyad Abd al-Rahman I consistently burned Christian churches and relics. So this is like later, this is once they actually took over. They were still continuing to do these types of things. If the invaders or the Muslims didn't destroy the church, what they would do is they'd basically just tear it down and then reuse the parts to build a mosque, or they would just simply convert the church into mosques. Al-Razi wrote, quote, Abd al-Rahman I would take all the bodies which the Christians honor and call saints, probably in reference to relics, and he would burn them, and he would burn their beautiful churches, some built by the Greeks and some by the Romans. The practice of tearing down and destroying churches all across Spain was just sort of standard operational procedure within all of the caliphate as Islamic armies conquered from the Arabian Peninsula into Jerusalem, into North Africa, and into the Iberian Peninsula. Morera notes, quote, changing prominent Christian churches into mosques was a standard feature of Muslim conquests. Muslims transformed many Greek basilicas in the Middle East and North Africa into mosques in the 7th and 8th centuries. They tore down many others to use their superior construction materials, including marble, gold, and silver. Traditional Arabic architecture used poor construction materials such as plaster, wood, and brick, evident in Andalusian palaces such as the Alhambra. And this is one of the reasons why Ibn Khaldun claimed that the construction of the Arabs were not solidly built and quickly fell into ruins. This is how mosques, including those in Damascus, the Great Umayyad Mosque, Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Cairo, the Amran Mosque, were built, and by Christian Greek architects to boot. According to the geographer Ibn al-Faq, circa 903, even the minarets of the Damascus mosques. According to the geographer Ibn al-Faq, circa 903, even the minarets of the Damascus mosque were originally watchtowers in the great Basilica of St. John the Baptist, all of which accounts of the Byzantine look of the mosques. Sort of reiterating here, but one of the biggest pieces of evidence we have that they did indeed just completely eradicate so much of the Christian structures and obviously in particular the churches is that as of today, we have no holy sites that we can find in southern Spain other than Catholic churches that were built during the Reconquest, so later on. So just in terms of the Visigoth church that certainly were there, those have now all been wiped off the face of the earth. Historian Jacques Fontaine concluded that the overwhelming destruction of Hispanic-Roman Visigoth sites in the region were most likely due to Islamic religious teachings. And he says, quote, there was a conscious policy of systemically erasing all Christian power signs from Al-Andalus. Morera obviously laments and comments on the great loss of these Roman Hispanic Visigoth writings. He says, quote, under the Visigoths, Toledo was an artistic center, as the archaeological remains of exquisite marble fragments indicate. But under Islam, the art of the Visigoth capital decayed as the conquerors wiped out the traces of Christian grandeur while focusing their artistic interests on their new southern capital of Cordoba. Sort of going back to the carrot and stick method and how the Islamic conquerors created these pacts that were frankly just temporary and in the long term completely bogus. It was simply a way of taking a city quickly and then moving on to continue conquering the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. An Islamic source by Ibn Abd al-Hakam titled The Chronicle Mos Arabica of 754 wrote, quote, after ravaging the land as far as Toledo, the royal city, Musa's conquerors were deceitful. They made peace offers to the surrounding regions with the help of Visigoth Lord Opus, son of the former king Egica, and executed a number of senior Visigoth lords that had remained in the city and put all of them to the sword with his help. Now, these deceitful practices were completely acceptable within Islamic law. Majid Kahaduri, an Islamic law scholar, says this about the law code in terms of reneging on former agreements with non-Muslims. He says, quote, Islam emerging in the 7th century as a conquering nation with world domination as its ultimate aim refused to recognize legal systems other than its own. It was willing to enter into temporary treaty relations with other states pending consummation of its world mission. The Prophet and his successors, however, reserved the right to repudiate any treaty or arrangement which they considered harmful to Islam. Although the normal relationship between Islam and non-Muslim communities in a state of hostility, it is not considered inconsistent with Islam's ultimate objective if a treaty is concluded with the enemy, whether for purposes of expediency or because Islam suffered a setback. So essentially what they were allowed to do within Islamic law is they could set up treaties if they were in a position that was not advantageous. And then once they could gain the upper hand, they could just renege because, of course, they were dealing with non-Muslims and it didn't matter to them. Generally speaking, Morera's thesis about the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula is that there were the Islamic armies used a variety of tactics or methods, but overall, just like a general term that he uses is they used shock and awe to defeat their enemies. So, for example, one anecdotal example, if you will, of this was during the conquest of Cordoba, many of the Christians fought back, they lost, and those who remained, many of the fighting men fled to the church. The Islamic conquerors burned down the church and all those inside. According to al-Makari, the Islamic invaders torched the building with all those inside. Like I said, al-Qadarbus, another Islamic historian, tells us that when Christians began to surrender, the Muslim commander had them all beheaded. Morera concludes, quote, the Visigoth church hymn Tempore Belli corroborates what other Christian and Muslim sources tell us regarding the terrifying but effective tactics used against the Christians. As the Spanish historian M.C. Diaz y Diaz put it, this liturgical Latin poem describes an implacable enemy, full of enthusiasm in the exercise of war, forcing Christian troops to turn around and flee in panic, sacking Christian temples and homes, burning the cities of those who resisted, and taking their young women as sexual slaves, all creating indescribable terror. Huge swaths of Christians, Hispanic Roman Christians, obviously fled the area as quickly as humanly possible, and they headed north from obviously the south. And they were going to the region of Asturias and Galicia, and there they met up with local inhabitants that obviously existed there. And even prior to the sort of southern group of Christians that moved or fled, the people of Asturias and Galicia had already determined that they were not going to allow the Islamic armies to continue to invade, and moreover, were not going to allow them to occupy their homeland. And so there was already this resistance that existed. And so when these people from the south arrived, the program of reconquest had already begun. I mean, this is very, very, very early on. This is not years in the making. I mean, almost immediately they had this concept or this idea ready to go. So conclusively, despite what the sort of common narrative is from, like I said, Islamic scholars and many historians, many intellectuals online, the conquest of Spain was absolutely brutal. It was chaotic. It was devastating. It was violent. And there was just unmitigated bloodshed and tragedy. Whole cities were destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. Millions of Hispanic Catholic Romans fled and were displaced. Obviously, the unlucky ones were killed on the spot. The others were enslaved. And the ones who were, I guess you could say, lucky were able to escape and establish a resistance. Those who remained in the cities became dhimmis or second-class citizens living under Islamic Sharia Maliki authority. And it was just absolutely brutal. In our next episode, we are actually going to get into the Reconquest of Spain, the details of it, the battles that took place. I think what I'm going to do is do sort of another episode covering just generally what happened. But what I really want to do is dive into the primary source material. I'm going to do a whole episode on El Cid. I'm going to do a whole episode on the conquest of Lisbon, which rarely, if ever, gets discussed, and how all of this, my idea, the concept where I'm trying to go with this, just give you a little insight. What happened during the conquest of Mexico by the conquistadors, a lot of their tactics, their strategy, their methods, their ideology came directly from the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. I'm super excited about this one. I'm pumped. I can't wait. I'll see you next time. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. I'll see you next time. Deuces.